Good afternoon, and welcome to the Center for Race and Public Education in the South, Race and Education Lecture Series. I am Dr. Derek Allridge, Director of the Center. As we kick off this lecture, it is my honor to introduce Dr. Robert Pianta, who is the Dean of the UVA School of Education and Human Development, the Novartis U.S. Foundation Professor of Education, Professor of Psychology, Founding Director of the Center for Advanced Study of Teaching and Learning at the University of Virginia, and most recently named to the National Academy of Education. Thank you, Dean Pianta, for joining us today.
Thank you, Derek, for that warm welcome. It is my pleasure to join you and all the attendees for this important race and education lecture with Dr. Eddie Cole. Welcome, Dr. Cole, and thank you to all of the partners who have helped support this important lecture. Before we begin, let us join in acknowledging and paying respect to the traditional custodians of the land on which we reside, the Monacan people. Our acknowledgement of the Monacan Nation reflects our commitment to a culture of inclusion by honoring those who were here first and whose continued presence is important to us and to our future. We also acknowledge and pay respect to the individual lives of the African peoples who were sold and held in enslavement here. These enslaved peoples built and sustain the everyday life of the university. And we acknowledge the contributions made by immigrants from Asia and the Pacific Islands who have endured decades of persecution and bias while seeking a better life here for their families and their communities. We recognize the pain that surfaces for them as a result of the recent shootings in Atlanta and the rise of anti-Asian American hate crimes in the last year. We at the School of Education and Human Development value diversity, equity, and inclusion in all of its complexity and richness. Dr. Allridge and I began having conversations about the development of a new research center at the school in 2016. And after the Unite the Right rally in August of 2017, we saw an urgent and specific need for leadership related to race and education with an emphasis and focus on the Southern United States. The center was launched in 2017 and has had an immediate impact. The center conducts and supports empirical research on a variety of issues that lie at the intersection of race, education, and schooling in the Southern United States. The collective work at the center also illuminates the causes, consequences, and potential means of ameliorating disparities in African-American youth's educational experiences and achievement. And the center is currently working on initiatives to improve the teaching of African-American history in K-12 education and to recruit more Black students into the teaching profession. This lecture series is one of many the center hosts that pushes our thinking on important topics relating to race and education. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Eddie Cole from UCLA to the center and to the UVA School of Education and Human Development. Dr. Cole's new book, The Campus Color Line: College Presidents and the Struggle for Black Freedom, maps the role of college presidents in shaping national conversations around racial equity in the mid-century. We're proud to host this lecture and the Q&A session afterwards. Now I'll turn it back to Dr. Allridge, whose intellectual leadership and stewardship of the center have been foundational to its success. I know he intends to give some announcements and to introduce Dr. Cole. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Pianta. I also want to mention a couple of quick housekeeping items. This is a Zoom webinar, which means as an attendee, you cannot use your video or microphone. We encourage you to utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit questions throughout the presentation that will be addressed during the designated Q&A time. Also, this talk is being recorded and will be available on the Center's YouTube channel afterwards. We are grateful to our co-sponsors for today's lecture, including the UVA School of Education and Human Development, the UVA School of Education and Human Development Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the UVA Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies, the UVA President's Commission on the University in the Age of Segregation, the UVA History Department, the Advanced Studies and Culture Foundation, and Charlottesville Epsilon Psi Boule of Sigma Pi Phi fraternity. I would also like to thank the Omega Psi Phi History Book Committee for supporting this event, and which Professor Eddie Cole, my brother, is also a member of. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eddie R. Cole for today's talk. Dr. Cole is an associate professor of higher education and organizational change at UCLA and received his PhD from Indiana University. Dr. Cole's research focuses on college presidents' historic role in shaping racial policies and practices, both inside and outside of the educational sphere. As a scholar of higher education history, his approach in covering historical material and making connections to the current critical context has garnered respect and praise from academics as well as intellectuals and activists beyond the academy. His finesse in using extensive historical materials to address contemporary racial issues in higher education demonstrates the role of higher education in influencing all aspects of American life. As Dean Pianta said, the center recognizes that the complex history of race in public schooling has implications for a range of other student populations in contemporary U.S. schools. And some of America's most pressing civil rights issues, desegregation, equal educational employment opportunities, housing discrimination, and free speech have been closely intertwined with higher education institutions. Dr. Cole's new book, He Shows How College Presidents, during a time of violence and unrest, strategically yet often silently initiated and shaped racial policies and practices inside and outside of the educational sphere. We are thrilled to welcome him to talk more about his book and his research today. So join me in welcoming Dr. Eddie Cole.
Good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon to my Eastern time zone family. But let me say good morning, depending on if you're behind the Eastern time zone, or potentially good evening or good night in this virtual world that we're in. I know people from all over are tuned in. So what an honor. Thank you for the kind introductions. And also let me send my many thanks to the University of Virginia, the university-wide community, but also to Charlottesville community, seeing so many organizations, both off campus as well, welcoming and including me and having me here for this lecture. But let's get into the business, shall we? So let me let me thank you for making time to join me in this conversation about my book, The Campus Color Line, which ultimately is a history of the Black freedom movement as seen through the actions of college presidents across the nation. It's a national history. And ultimately what I argue, as you just heard, is that college presidents actively, although oftentimes quietly, were involved with shaping numerous racial policies and practices, both as it pertains to higher education, but also policies and practices related to race beyond the campus as well. So an influential group of people that have shaped so many policies and practices that we're still grappling with today. In fact, during this time in the mid 20th century, and the years I focus on being 1948 through 1968, we see this point of racial violence also being prominent. And the image on the cover of the book, I just want to draw your attention to it, in that you see this distinct color line between a group of Black students and white students. And one of the white students actually has a hammer in their right hand, willing to use his hammer in racial violence. And this is an image that no college president wanted to see. If you could imagine him looking out of the window of the president's office. And I came across this photograph when I was actually in the archives at the University of Alabama, looking through the president's papers for Frank Rose, who was the president there, and that an alumnus of the University of Alabama had sent this brochure with this image to the president saying, I hope the University of Alabama can avoid this kind of violence, what we just seen a year earlier at the University of Mississippi when it came time for James Meredith, the first Black student, to enroll there. So you see this particular moment where college presidents are engaged in such a pressing and urgent matters around race. But before I get into the history, I'm gonna talk a lot about history today, but before I get too deep into the history, I actually want to give you a little snapshot of some contemporary moments. Let's fast forward to right now. Perhaps some of you have seen this image. If not, this is from the University of Missouri in 2015. You see Black students on the football team fielding media questions surrounded by their peers after they threatened to boycott the upcoming game in November 2015 against BYU if the president and chancellor of the University of Missouri, both the Columbia campus and the system, did not resign after a series of racial incidents went unaddressed. So you see this moment. This is an image that, as I was in the archives studying, reading through papers for this book, These are some of the national headlines that were unfolding. What about this image? You may not have seen it, but you can pick up pretty quickly what's going on here. This is in Philadelphia. Temple University with its plans to build a new football stadium on campus. In exchange, some local residents in North Philadelphia would be displaced from their homes as the university expanded its presence. Again, this is a headline, an image that I'm seeing when I'm in the archives working on this book. How about this image? Let's fast forward. So we went from 2015 to 2016 to 2017 in sort of this 3-year period as I was in the archives. This image, if you can't see it, let me read it to you. Here's spray paint on the campus of Howard University, a private historically Black university in Washington, D.C. It says, "Welcome to the Trump Plantation, Overseer Wayne A.I. Frederick. President Frederick leads Howard University." This comes up on campus after Howard administrators meet with former US President Donald Trump. And let me show this one more image as I was sort of polishing off my archival work that you all, the University of Virginia, likely are quite familiar with. August 2017. Tiki torches in the background, Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, simply now known as Charlottesville, right? This is another image that I saw when I was working on this book. And you see the tension here, sort of the question about where does hate speech begin and where does free speech end, right? This broader question. But when you look at these images and you look at the headlines that followed these images, one thing becomes clear. Whether we know it or not, consciously or unconsciously, we look toward university leaders, specifically chancellors and presidents. So from the New York Times to the Chronicle of Higher Education to the Washington Post and so many dozens and dozens of other headlines, we see immediate attention after a moment of race, a racial incident happens on college campuses. We look toward college presidents and their role in helping make sense of the university community engage with racial policies and practices. But oftentimes, what I notice in the public statements, this is me in the archives, looking at the public statements of headlines, when I sort of take a break and look at my phone, seeing what's going on in the world, we notice that these public statements actually don't reference history. It's sort of this sort of one-off reaction, these public statements that administrators issue in response to a racial incident. But there's so much more history there. And that's what sent me on my way when I got into the archives. So just for the graduate students who may be, watching this and interested in methods, I just want to briefly talk about methods. And so I ended up traveling to nearly 30 different colleges and universities across the United States. I started in North Carolina. I went from there down to Georgia, from Georgia to Tennessee up to Central New York, and Syracuse. From Syracuse went to Madison, Wisconsin, Ann Arbor, Michigan. I remember leaving Ann Arbor, going to Baltimore next, taking the train from Baltimore to Philadelphia, from Philadelphia down to Austin, Texas, then out to the West Coast. Did the Bay Area first, Berkeley and Stanford, came down to LA, UCLA, USC. Then I went back down south, stopped in Memphis to do Memphis State, now the University of Memphis, came down to Jackson, Mississippi, did Jackson State and Tougaloo College, private and public, historically Black college, then came halfway back up the state of Mississippi to Oxford, Mississippi, University of Mississippi. Then I went across state lines, University of Alabama. From there, I went to Chicago, from Chicago, Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University. What you see in total is this combination, this national history unfolding to where you're looking at university leaders and you're not just looking at the same institutional types, right? When you talk about race and higher education history, this isn't exclusive to trying to understand historically Black colleges only in the South. I looked at private and public HBCUs. I looked at private and public predominantly white institutions, but I also went beyond the South to the Northeast, the Midwest, and on the West Coast. And I also got a variety around sort of the social standing of many of these institutions as well. I didn't just focus on the usual players, right? I wanted to look at some smaller regional local colleges and how those presidents were also engaged in conversations with institutions that are considered elite. And what's really enjoyable about this book is that you get a chance to put someone like Martin Jenkins, the president of Morgan State University, alongside someone like Clark Kerr, the president of the University of California system, and putting these presidents in conversation with each other, because believe it or not, they were actually in communication more often than we think. They weren't these strict regional boundaries or these strict institutional type boundaries as well. So you see this wide range of institutions. Now, here's a little snippet of what I was looking at when I went from town to town, city to city, campus to campus. I would look at the official president's office records, but I'll also look at president's personal papers, because it's also important to understand who these individuals were and how they were grappling with issues beyond their professional responsibilities. And then I looked at newspapers as well, but I didn't just look at sort of the mainstream newspaper in a particular city. I also looked at, say, the Black-owned newspaper in the city. And I looked at student newspapers as well, because all of these different media outlets had a particular interpretation of how incidents were unfolding on these campuses. And also went from there, when I was in the state capitol, I also made an effort to stop by state archives and records to get some understanding of the pressure from elected officials, particularly as it pertains to the leaders of public state-supported universities and colleges as well. And from there, I went to local historical societies also. That was critical, because it's one thing to study higher education history, but you can't only look at the university's archives and record keeping. You must also look at community archives and community record keeping. That's also essential. And neighborhood associations. And I'm gonna get into housing and gentrification, the role of that as well. But neighborhood associations as well have a tight historical relationship with colleges and universities. And then finally, looking at census records. Very telling, because as you see communities shift over time and universities expand, people who used to live on a certain city block no longer live on a certain city block. And that has racial implications as well. I ended up consulting thousands of primary sources in the process of writing this book. Now you may ask, okay, what do you do with thousands of primary sources? How do you organize that? Well, when you look across that many institutions, that many states, that many regions, themes emerge. And so the book is organized in a way that's pretty straightforward, in that the first chapter focuses on Black college presidents, the Black presidents of Black colleges, and their role in dismantling segregation and segregationist policies. And this is very important, and I'll talk about this shortly. But understanding these presidents is sort of sets the tone for the book, because you can't talk about the role of college presidents in the struggle for Black freedom without paying particular attention to Black college presidents. And it's sort of this region-wide look, not just looking in the Deep South, but the Upper South and the Deep South in connection to and networks among these presidents. That ends up being very important. Another theme that emerged ends up being the role of the university in housing discrimination. That's important in the role of university leaders in shaping not only local housing policy, not only state level housing policy, but federal housing policy. From there, in the third chapter, I talk about race, university systems, and bureaucratic resistance, and how systems built in by administrators stall tactics for how universities have responded to student activism and community activism. From there, in chapters 4 and 5, I get into the desegregation of the last holdouts among the segregated, predominantly white institutions in the South, going to the University of Mississippi and then the University of Alabama, looking at not just the James Meredith racial riot at the University of Mississippi in 1962, but particularly how did the chancellor help a university recover from a moment of racial violence on campus. And then chapter 5, looking at the University of Alabama, looks at how did the university president coordinate efforts to prevent racial violence on campus in 1963, so that that institution wouldn't have a repeat of the racial violence from 1956. And then I wrap up the book looking at the role of free speech in civil rights, and then also looking at the original plans for affirmative action in higher education and the roles that college presidents played in shaping those policies for higher education. So the book covers a lot of ground, a lot of topics that are quite relevant to this moment right now. But with that said, understanding that the book covers so much ground, just for today, let's get into the meat of the conversation. I'm just going to talk about the first 2 chapters of the book. So we'll treat this moment sort of like a Google preview. You can only get a little snippet of the first chapter, Black Presidents and the Dismantling of Segregation, and the second chapter, the University and Housing Discrimination. So the first chapter of the book, I love this quote. This captures so much of the delicate dance that Black presidents of Black colleges had to do during the Black freedom movement in leading those institutions. And this quote says, "It is more desirable at this time to advance the interests of the institution now committed to our care than to engage in controversy." That quote comes from Morris A. Soper. Morris A. Soper is the white man in the background looking directly into the camera. He's the chair of the Morgan State College, now Morgan State University, Board of Trustees. Shaking hands with the governor is Martin D. Jenkins, the president of Morgan State. The governor there, Theodore McKelvin. Now, this is important because this quote, this letter from Soper to Martin Jenkins comes 2 days, only 2 days after Martin Jenkins accepts the invitation to become president of Morgan State, only 2 days later. So one of the first pieces of advice, if you will, from the Board of Trustee chair is that let's sort of stay out of the controversy. We've got some other things that this campus needs to worry about. This is the perfect image, really, to capture this sort of dance that these individuals had to do. But the question that I was interested in was how? How do these Black college presidents actually engage in shaping racial policies and practices? Because there's one sort of common narrative in that these presidents, particularly Black presidents of state-supported institutions, really were at the mercy of white elected officials, like the one whose hand is being, handshake right there. But there's something more happening behind closed doors. So let me tell you a little bit about Martin David Jenkins. Martin David Jenkins was born in Terre Haute, Indiana in September 1904. And upon graduating from high school, Wiley High School, which was a desegregated high school in Terre Haute, he goes to Howard University. He studies at Howard in undergrad from 1921 to 1925. This is a particularly important moment to be a student at Howard University because it's really the peak of the new Negro movement, right? So fundamentally, intellectually, I know Professor Aldrich can really relate to this, right? Intellectually, there's a lot of transformation happening, and Howard University is a focal point for this work. But upon graduating from Howard University in Washington, D.C., Martin Jenkins returns home to Terre Haute, to where he works with his father's business, which is a construction company, specifically a highway construction company. But after a couple of years of doing that, working with his father back in Terre Haute, he leaves that job and actually pursues a second bachelor's degree at Indiana State Teachers College, now Indiana State University. And so he gets 2 bachelor's degrees and starts to pursue a career in education. From there, he goes to Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, where he earns his master's in 1933 and his PhD in education in 1935. Now, this is important because during this time frame of Black students going to research universities in the Northeast or the Midwest or elsewhere to attain graduate level education, Martin Jenkins has this relationship with his advisor, Paul Whitty, a white professor who actually happens to also be from Terre Haute and only 6 years older than Martin Jenkins. But they start working together, and that's actually rare. Michael R. Winston, notable scholar, has an article in the 1970s about how between 1930 and 1943, there are only 317 Black people in the United States who've earned a PhD during this time frame. So Martin Jenkins is in a very select group. And most often these predominantly white institutions like Northwestern, like Harvard, like University of Chicago would enroll Black students, but they wouldn't engage or mentor and support those Black students' careers. It's sort of like you get your degree and go on to wherever you need to go, but you're not going to work and continue to study here or have a meaningful relationship. But in building a network to dismantle segregation, Martin Jenkins actually starts to co-author and publish with his advisor, Paul Whitty. And in 1936, I'm working clockwise on this image in front of you. In 1936, they published an article in the Journal of Psychology, which challenges the idea around Black youth and intellectual ability, right? And this is really, really notable. This is so important at this point because this challenges the idea about testing and the ability of Black students, okay? So that's also notable in that this actually fundamentally challenges the idea that the amount of Black, the amount of whiteness, which many psychologists were arguing, determine intellectual ability. And Martin Jenkins, through a scholarly pursuit, said, oh no, that is not the case. Now, with that said, he started his career first at North Carolina A&T, where he was both a registrar and a professor of education. Then he goes to Cheney, now Cheney State, Cheney University in Pennsylvania, and briefly works there. And in 1938, he returns as a faculty member to Howard University. This is notable because during this time frame, there are very few Black colleges that are offering collegiate level education, as historian James Anderson has explained to us years ago. But Howard is one of the few. And so it's important for Martin Jenkins, who's interested in scholarly pursuits, to actually land at a Black college that actually offers this sort of collegiate level thought, including some graduate level work, okay? So he gets to Howard in 1938 as a faculty member, returning to his alma mater. And by 1940, Martin Jenkins, who is an expert in studying gifted education, particularly gifted himself in survey research, becomes notable because what he does, he gains the attention of so many Southern states, including the federal government. And he ends up working for the U.S. Office of Education as a senior specialist in higher education. And he ends up doing survey research across 22 states, numerous cities, as well as different institutions. And he's just become a prolific scholar. And by 1942, he's published 26 articles, including white academic journals, such as the Journal of Higher Education, which is still out of Ohio State, or School of Society, but also Black-run academic journals, such as the Journal of Negro Education. And then from there, he's an award-winning because of his work in challenging this idea of race in education, these racist ideas in education. He's received the Selective Service Medal because he's a researcher for the American Teachers Association, and Black teacher networks are important in this as well because of the tight relationship between Black colleges and Black teachers. And then by 1946, he gets an invitation from the Maryland Commission on Higher Education to become a special consultant on Black education. So what you see through Martin Jenkins is just strategy, that he ends up working through white academic circles as well as Black academic circles, and positions himself in a unique way to get tapped for numerous opportunities where he can strategically challenge segregation and racist ideas as it pertains to Black education. So he's built out a network over this 10-year period, and by 1948, he's tapped to become president of Morgan State. Now, with that said, he gets immediately to work as the president of a Black college. And you see just a few snippets here, a few images that I came across in the archives that show just how Martin Jenkins was working to dismantle segregation. One particular thing is the relationship between Black educators and Black media. He actually testifies before the Senate Judiciary Committee. I don't know how often we think about Black college presidents giving federal testimonies on this idea around education, because Southern governors came up with this plan to where they were going to establish regional schools. Instead of desegregating their all-white universities in the South, many of them said, let's come up with a plan where we can just sort of make regional professional schools for Black people, and we can send our local residents to those schools instead. Martin Jenkins testifies before the Senate to challenge that idea. Another thing that he did was also, you see here, Virginia history in district court makes an appearance, a testimony, expert witness with regard to the desegregation of Alexandria, Virginia schools, right? And there's a case that comes up in the late 1940s with regard to segregation in that city and Black schools not being equal to white schools. Martin Jenkins, again, using his position to quietly yet importantly shape racial policies. This case eventually was ruled in favor of the Black schools in challenging segregation. Most notably, Morris A. Soper, the white man who's the chair of Morgan State College, who's in the background of that initial picture, He's actually a federal judge that actually rules on that. So you see the network happening here between Martin Jenkins and the actual chair of the Morgan State Board of Trustees making these rulings at the federal level. And then also you see here from the Baltimore Afro-American, you see Martin Jenkins again testifying in court. I mean, he's a busy individual here. Now, with that said, this brings me fast forward to understanding presidential networks in so many ways that Martin Jenkins rightfully understood that the things that he could get away with as the president of a state-supported Black college in Maryland is much different than what his contemporaries who were leading state-supported Black colleges in the Deep South could get away with. But they were strategists and they understood how to make this happen. So I always like to share this when we talk about the sit-ins in 1960. I like to share this speech by Martin Jenkins during fall convocation in the fall of 1960, where he tells a group of students at Morgan State, we are witnessing in this country and indeed throughout the world an almost revolutionary movement against racial segregation and discrimination. This movement has many facets. This is a good movement and it has surprisingly beneficial results. This is him speaking out. And the title of the speech was Stand Up. He was telling Morgan State students to continue the sit-ins and stand up. But 3 weeks later, as you see here on the program, Cornelius V. Troop, who's the president of Fort Valley State College, a land-grant institution down in Georgia, invites Martin Jenkins to campus to be the Founders Day program speaker. Now, Cornelius V. Troop, the president of Fort Valley State, couldn't dare say something like, let's support the sit-ins as the president of a state-supported college in Georgia. But Martin Jenkins came and gave the exact identical speech at Fort Valley State. And so what we saw here was these networks through these presidents to where oftentimes, strategically, they could bring in someone else to say what they certainly absolutely could not say in an effort to quietly put aside their personal reputation, but ultimately challenge segregation in a way that therefore not as many of these Black college presidents have a reputation of being sort of publicly vocal in the same kind of ways, but at the same time, they were working together to do so. So this is just a little snippet of how these Black college presidents and Black college presidential networks were at work in challenging segregation and shaping racial policies and practices, because Martin Jenkins was also advising white elected officials in Maryland on out-of-state aid programs, because Maryland, like many Southern states, were also paying to send Black residents out of state or to other institutions instead of desegregating its segregated all white institutions. But I can talk so much more about that, but let's also jump over to the second chapter of the book. Let's talk about the university and the housing discrimination, because this is also important in a really insightful glimpse into understanding how these presidents were shaping racial policies and practices. And this quote captures it nicely. This is from Velma Hill, a Black woman, an activist who was speaking at the University of Chicago in 1962 during a student rally. And she says, quote, "The octopus in the South has tentacles in the North. You are part of a real movement, a real civil rights movement is taking place here." I love that quote. It's so insightful because it shows this connection between the first chapter and the second chapter, in that as Martin Jenkins was quietly doing actions with Black college presidents without fanfare, what we saw outside of the South were a number of white college presidents actually seeking publicity for what they were doing. And let me give a little example. What we see here in Chicago, as well as many other cities in the Northeast and across the Midwest, is that post-World War II, you get the second wave of the Great Migration, and millions of Black residents leave the Jim Crow South looking for a better life in cities like Chicago. But what happens is Chicago is so deeply segregated itself is that the neighborhoods where Black people could move to soon had overcrowding. Now, the University of Chicago is located in Hyde Park. That's the name of that neighborhood. To the west of Hyde Park is Washington Park, predominantly Black. To the south of Hyde Park is Woodlawn neighborhood, also predominantly Black, right? What happens is the overcrowding from Washington Park and Woodlawn soon ease into Hyde Park. That's why the University of Chicago, unlike many institutions post-World War II, actually sees a decline in its enrollment. Post-World War II, the narrative is post-war higher education enrollments triple, if not quadruple. University of Chicago actually hits a decline, almost as low as it was in 1918. Why? Because white students, white faculty, white administrators did not want to study so close to Black people in the Black neighborhood. It's the ultimate story around having some Black students, some Black professionals, but not too much Blackness near campus. Now, because of this, Lawrence Kipton, who you see here on the right, the chancellor of the University of Chicago, immediately calls a meeting among other college presidents of urban universities. And this is so notable here. In 1957, Lawrence Kipton organizes a meeting among the president of Harvard, MIT, the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University, and Yale University. These 6 presidents come together and they start to strategize around how they can save their universities located in these major metropolitan areas from getting encroached upon by Black neighborhoods, and in turn being more enticing to white faculty, students, and staff. And ultimately, what we see emerge out of this meeting is that these presidents soon start to lobby before federal officials. College presidents meet and shape federal housing policy. And so in 1959, here's a headline here: University of Chicago leads a capital march for more housing. And ultimately what happens is the University of Chicago and these other institutions, and soon dozens of them, start getting involved. Beyond the original 6 meeting, you get NYU, Temple University, Seattle University, University of Louisville, Baylor University. I mean, dozens of institutions, these white college presidents come together and they go to Washington, D.C., and they get a change to the Federal Housing Act in 1959. And federal officials agree to give a $2 to $1 investment to what universities put up to acquire property near their campuses. Now, this property acquisition really ends up meaning they're buying up buildings, apartments, homes that Black people have long lived in, or landlords were renting to Black people. And they ultimately wiped out these blocks and held this property where there was segregationist practices happening and rent discrimination in housing. And so the University of Chicago ends up being involved in leading a national movement around college presidents shaping national policy, in that if the University of Chicago put up $1, federal dollars were $2. So this becomes multiple millions and millions. And the way that they were able to do this is also important because the Black community picked up on this. The Urban League report in Chicago in 1958 called out what the university was doing because it wasn't addressing the issue of housing discrimination. It was simply displacing thousands of households, the majority of which being Black people. And one strategy for how the University of Chicago was able to do this and get Columbia and many others to get involved with this was a strategic public relations campaign. The director of public relations here, here's one issue, one letter here in the top right for you, where you see a letter from the director of public relations for the University of Chicago writes to NBC. After watching the television profile on Cuba, the public relations director suggests that NBC may be interested in doing a profile on the University of Chicago and seeing how it is, quote, saving America's cities from itself, right? So this is the moment of urban renewal and white flight and the role of higher education in doing so. And it also pitches the idea that there are several other notable institutions also involved in this campaign. So you see headlines in the US News and World Report, the New York Times, Newsweek, House and Home, I mean, national magazines and newspapers praising the University of Chicago for this effort. And the urban renewal program around the University of Chicago alone ends up being around $200 million. And that's a lot for right now. Imagine what it was in the 1950s, early 1960s. But here's the shift that's notable here. What happens when you see the sit-ins that I just mentioned in Southern Black students pick up in 1960, white students on white campuses beyond the South also take note of how their college-age contemporaries are also willing to put their lives on the line for equal rights. And so there's sort of this wake-up moment that happens when the Black freedom movement takes off among college students in the South. You also see solidarity efforts and this attention toward what's happening in the Northeast, the Midwest, and campuses on the West Coast as well. And so you see students at the University of Chicago in 1962 actually hold a sit-in in the president's office that lasts for 3 weeks. And you see headlines in the Chicago Defender. Also, a notable black newspaper, also criticizing the University of Chicago around this idea of being a liberal institution, yet is contradicting itself in how it is engaged actively in perpetuating housing discrimination. And what happens is when the president, now President George Beadle of the University of Chicago, actually leaves town and goes to San Francisco to give a fundraising speech during this president's office sit-in, he's met by students at the University of California, Berkeley, who are protesting him upon his arrival. Because you see this sort of national snapshot here of how college presidents were shaping these federal policies and how students were communicating as well. This is all notable because after there becomes student pressure, the trustees at the University of Chicago, after nearly 30 years of engaging in racial restrictive covenants, and then when those are outlawed, engaging in shaping federal housing policy, the trustees in April 1962 finally changed university policy that says that the university will no longer be involved in properties that engage in discrimination. That's notable. And just two examples, again, of how college presidents have actively shaped racial policies and practices. But with that said, being mindful of time and wanting to get into this conversation here, I just want to bring up some considerations of the campus color line today and things that we're seeing, and especially its applicability to understanding the two chapters that I shared just now. HBCUs right now, there's a question around accreditation. And the United Negro College Fund, UNCF, has issued a report a few years ago that shows that there's a disproportionate amount of accreditation sanctions levied on HBCUs disproportionately compared to how many institutions they represent. But that doesn't grapple with the issues that Martin Jenkins, accreditation processes don't completely grapple with the issues that Martin Jenkins was fighting for in the 1940s and 1950s. And so it does invite us to think about the long history of discrimination as it pertains to HBCUs and the role of Black educators in challenging those practices. And also there's this question around land grant funding inequities. I just saw a headline from yesterday about Tennessee State University. A report just came out that the state of Tennessee has not been giving its full amount of land grant funding over the years to Tennessee State University, historically Black college, somewhere to the tune of coming up short between $150 million to $544 million over the lifetime of that institution. I mean, we're talking about $500 million that the state owes one college, right? But again, this is what history, understanding the role of these presidents, and what the book invites us to think about, is that part of the Black freedom movement is understanding the role of education as well. And what does that mean when we fast forward to today and we still haven't reconciled with these issues from the past? Then there's the question of gentrification. Historically, this pertained to large cities, as I mentioned, New York, Chicago, Boston. But when we fast forward to right now, the idea of university expansion, medical centers expanding, taking over more space in cities, not paying its fair share in taxes for city property, that's relevant right now. And we see that unfolding in Clemson, South Carolina, which we don't think of as a major place where the university is shaping housing situation. But I'm sure it's applicable to Charlottesville too, right? And we can go on to many other cities as well, and how we think about the role of our universities in perpetuating these issues. And then finally, this idea of reckoning with the past. Is notable to me when you see many universities. University of Virginia certainly is one of them, but many universities, dozens of them, publicly acknowledging its benefit from the institution of slavery. But that's a few hundred years ago. It's a little bit easier to acknowledge the university's missteps from so far ago. But what about more immediate past issues, right? From the 1950s and 1960s, 70s and 80s, to where you engage with issues right now that continue to shape and form the campus color line. And campus policing is one of those issues right now that is a hot topic, and universities have to be able to grapple with that more immediate history and examine their role again in perpetuating racial outcomes. And with that said, that's just a little bit of flavor around sort of how bringing this full circle from the images at the beginning to talking about history and bringing us back around to thinking about today. I look forward to this conversation, and I must acknowledge, due to all the travel that went into this book, it wouldn't be possible without the support of the National Academy of Education, the Spencer Foundation, as well as the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation that supported it. So again, many thanks to the University of Virginia community for bringing me in, and I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Cole. I just have to say that your study is fascinating, and I was struck when I read your book with the amount of research that you did and that you put in it. Is just extraordinary. And so, we've talked about that, and I'm sure you'll get some questions about that. If not right now, later on in the graduate student panel. I want to ask you a quick question, though. And for those of you who want to ask questions, use the Q&A function or raise your hand. But you mentioned the Black college presidents' engagement with Black teachers associations. And I know you get into that later on, but could you talk some about the role that Black college presidents played in K through 12 education?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. That's a great question, a very important question to understand in the first chapter in Martin Jenkins, who I was mentioning earlier. But you have to understand the development of Black colleges in general, coming out of the late 1800s, post-slavery, as well as into the early 1900s, and understanding that, as James Anderson noted in his book, that many of these colleges were college in name only. So most often when we think of somewhere like a perfect example, if you go back to Maryland, which I was discussing in the book, is the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. We think of that now as a four-year institution, but during the time frame that Martin Jenkins was taking over at Morgan State, it's Princess Anne Academy, and ultimately it's a secondary school. And so what we see oftentimes is this relationship between Black college presidents leading these institutions, or principals, frankly, leading institutions that were evolving into Black colleges. And so when you look at Black teacher associations, even if you look at something like Martin Jenkins and his speaking schedule, it was just remarkable to think how often he was going from state to state speaking. One of his most common stops every year was speaking to the state level teacher associations. So he went and spoke to the Virginia Teachers Association. And while there's also other Black college presidents in attendance. And you can see them coordinating among each other under this idea of teacher associations, but also strategizing. And he goes down to Florida and talks to the Teachers Association. He goes to South Carolina, talks to the Black Teachers Association. He's in North Carolina talking to the Black Teachers Association. Everybody knows Martin Jenkins because through the American Teachers Association, which is the overall Black Teachers Association, he's actually the head of the research committee for the National Black Teachers Association. And so he's doing this survey research during this time frame, collecting information about what's happening from state to state and using that information strategically to turn around and go talk to white elected officials and just put the information and the research results in front of them. I mean, it's methodical in how he's approaching this. And just to understand just his relationship between K-12 and Black higher education is so tight knit, in that right now we sort of think in silos, but for Black colleges, it's never been that way and couldn't afford to be that way, because the struggle for Black freedom and the role of these presidents in shaping policies and practices, that meant they had to be in touch with the individual schoolhouse teacher as well as the governor, all in the course of the same day.
Wow, thanks. I really appreciate that. So I'm gonna ask a few questions that have come up here in the Q&A. One question is, how can HBCUs reclaim their lost land and funds from the US government?
Yeah. That's a great question. It's so applicable to what I'm watching happen in Nashville right now, what I just referenced to Tennessee State University. In all likelihood, it's going to have to go through the long process of the courts. The legal fight is one way that you're going to have to understand how HBCUs can rightfully reclaim the funds that both federal and states owe to these institutions. I mean, you're going to have to make the court battle. But one particular thing in making the legal argument for these HBCUs, which is why I enjoyed this book so much, and I mean, it's so much information on Maryland alone and Martin Jenkins, is that that's where the role of history comes in, because you're talking about historic wrongdoings. And you're going to have to seriously engage in understanding the history and getting into the archives and connecting the dots and pulling together these ledgers from decades past and seeing the funny business with the money. And I think that's really what it's going to come down to. And so you can't have this sort of contemporary argument right now in 2021 without understanding what was happening in 1971 and in 1951 and in 1931, because what we're talking about is the accumulation of funds that these institutions should have had. And that connects nicely, that question, to the comment that I made about accreditation. Because one instance of measure around whether an institution is in good academic standing is its financial stability. And if you're going to ding or critique an HBCU on financial stability, but not take into consideration decades of funding inequities, then you see the miscommunication here to where we're just perpetuating an inequitable system without looking at history.
Wow. Thank you, Professor Cole. So there's a question that says, that asks, Faulkner said that the past is never dead. Mm-hmm. It's not the past. I study police executives in the context of race, policing, and public governance. These executives, like university presidents, are facing a great deal of public scrutiny due to the issues of the day. When considering the racial reckoning and reimagining systems and structures movement, we are university presidents, principals, agents, or both? Do they have agency? Can they act independently to make decisions that benefit their institutions, or are they limited in what they can say and do?
That's a good question. That's a great question. I enjoyed that one. One of the most effective approaches that emerges from the book, history gives us so much insight on the present. One of the most effective approaches that we see in the book is that you see university leaders who are able to align their personal beliefs with their professional responsibilities and professional goals. So if you're a university leader and you completely believe in fighting for racial equity, then your leadership as a president, chancellor, has to also be geared toward fighting for racial equity. You can't say, I want to do this on this side personally, but I can't quite do it over here. And what you see historically, I mean, really engage the book. What you see historically is a number of presidents like Martin Jenkins who can publicly say, right, like, I don't agree with segregation. I mean, he says this during his inauguration speech with the governor of Maryland on the platform just behind him, right? In a segregation, in a racist higher education system, a dual system, he makes it plain as he's been inaugurated to lead the state-supported Black school that he can't separate his personal beliefs on segregation and how wrong it is alongside what he's expected to do leading the Black school in the state of Maryland. And so what we see for presidents today, I think they have to be willing to step out front and lead the institution, because otherwise, what are you truly doing in this role and in this position? Are you simply doing a delicate dance, but are you truly moving the needle toward racial equity, or are you simply holding the position? And that's really what history gives us so many examples of. If you want to be the most effective at leadership, those two things are aligned. And that's what gives me a lot of hope about the present, because these racial policies and practices didn't just happen. They were shaped and molded by individuals who took individual actions and made decisions. And so right now, today, you have to have university leaders who are willing to make individual decisions and take actions for the better.
Thank you. Another question, what advice do you have for students who may be interested in employing similar research methods? Specifically, how do you make decisions about how to pare down immense numbers of pages or volumes of primary materials?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oftentimes, my advice to students with that question is let the themes emerge. I mean, truly, right? So if you've got let's imagine if you got 10 documents in front of you. I'm not going to talk about 1,000. Let's say you got 10 documents in front of you. And when you look at those 10 and you're reading across them, you see 2 or 3 themes emerge. That's what you focus in on. And so one example is I went to more institutions that were involved in universities and housing discrimination than just the University of Chicago. All right. I went to the University of Pennsylvania, right? I went to a half dozen other institutions where presidents were involved in these same conversations. But the University of Chicago, when you let the theme emerge, that became the richest, most detailed example of telling that story. And you focus in on what's really going to capture the national story as seen through an individual institution or individual actor. I didn't have to quote every president about how they were dealing with the Black community that they were displacing. All I had to do was look at the one institution that was really the focal point, the center of the axis that were bringing other presidents into this conversation. And that's really how you have to approach primary source material, because there's so much information out there that we haven't even had a chance to engage with, that you let the themes emerge and then you look at the most compelling story. And that's really the heart of your work right there.
Professor Cole, we appreciate that workshop on methodology and how you approach your research. That's awesome. So another question says, first, she says, thank you for your talk. I am excited to read your book and incorporate it in future syllabi. Can you comment on the role or impact of New England schools in this debate? I noticed they are missing. Is there a difference, reticence of these institutions in New England to engage in these debates? I ask because I went to UVA for undergrad and law school and then up to New England. There appears to be a remarkable difference in the handling of race issues by university presidents across time, style, and attention between this region and the rest of the US.
Yeah, that's a great question. My short answer is going to be no. There's not necessarily a difference between what we see in New England and elsewhere, even though sort of the prevailing narrative may want to suggest as much. And I say no because when you look at as many institutions as I looked at, I saw the correspondence from the presidents and chancellors of New England institutions writing to Chicago, right? I understand Harvard's role in its tense relationship between Cambridge and the Harvard University campus, or the president of MIT, right? If we're going to talk about New England, Yale as well, right? These institutions are involved in these larger themes that unfold in the book. And one thing that I discuss a lot in the book, and you'll get a good flavor of New England if you look at the book, is that when you look at presidential networks, you look at where these people were, who they're connected to, who they were in school with, who they studied alongside, who they known from 30 years prior to becoming the president, you start to see that there are no regional boundaries to the challenges before these particular institutions. And so in turn, you see what's happening in Rhode Island, right? Or Massachusetts, or even, Vermont, for instance, still are grappling with the same issues, particularly because those institutions had Black students. They didn't have a lot of them, but they had Black students, and questions of race in the university were certainly prevalent there as well. So that's a phenomenal question and great observation. But when you get into the book and see the details and who's corresponding with who, you get a nice flavor that so many of these institutions were grappling with the same question. Because one of my favorite examples is a letter from a president in North Dakota to the chancellor of the University of Mississippi after the James Meredith riot. And all of a sudden, even though I didn't physically go to North Dakota, I got a lot of flavor looking at that correspondence saying, oh, there's some interesting things happening at the top of the Great Plains as well. There's questions around race also.
We have time for one more question, Professor Cole, and here's the question. Dr. Cole, thank you for your outstanding presentation and for your powerful scholarship. My question is, did you see a distinction in the roles of presidents of private colleges in contrast to presidents of public colleges in the struggle?
That's a great question. That's a yes and no sort of answer to that one. Yes, well, no, in the sense that the issues were the same. What they're grappling with is very similar. regardless of whether they're leaving a private institution or a state-supported institution. But the answer, yes, in the sense of how many other sort of actors, agents, as one of the previous questions mentioned, those presidents had to interact with. One particular example, I could pick on UCLA. And so one particular example would be UCLA and having Chancellor Franklin Murphy arrive in 1960 and being completely thrown off, completely caught by surprise, because LA had this image of being a sort of Western racial oasis. But upon arrival, he saw that the Westwood community right next to the University of California, Los Angeles campus was discriminating against Black students. Barbers wouldn't cut the hair of Black students. Local landlords wouldn't rent to Black students. This is a very distinctive moment of racism as it unfolds at UCLA. But leading a public institution, it became a different layer of bureaucracy for trying to get answers and policies changed, in the sense that that chancellor reported to assistant president. That assistant president reported to a board of regents, which also was involved with the governor, right? And so even in California, you see leading a public institution has a slightly different flavor, slightly different nuance and challenges, as opposed to if they were leading a private institution in California, such as Stanford, where Wallace Sterling was president, or Norman Topping was the president of the University of Southern California, also in LA. So that's a great question, very thoughtful question. And you see some differences in how many people a public institution has to deal with in comparison to how many a private institution president has to deal with.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Cole, for joining us today for this Race and Education lecture. Please join us for the next event in this series on Wednesday, April 21st at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will be hosting a panel discussion on Pushing the Boundaries, a conversation on the future of anti-bias research and practice in education. This lecture will feature Dr. Stephanie Curitin from Boston University and Dr. Maria C. Pena from Montclair State University, and will be moderated by Center affiliate Dr. Natalia Palacios. Please download the iCalendar or save the Zoom information for our events website. Also, please follow us on social media for regular updates from the center. Thank you for attending this lecture and have a great rest of your day. And thank you, Professor Cole.
Thank you for having me. Take care, everybody. Be safe.